Hi guys, welcome to Christy's Book Corner. I'm your host, Christy Mason, and we're going to continue with our book, Finding Jacob Wetterling by Robert M. Dudley. And this chapter is chapter 8, and it's called Sleuths. The Sleuths, which means like detective work and stuff like that. Sleuthing, if you ever read Nancy Drew, that might be a good one for me to read, but for now we're gonna do with this one. So, chapter 8, The Sleuths. Stupid thing. Okay. I get slightly obsessive about working in archives because you don't know what you're going to find. In fact, you don't know what you're looking for until you find it. Anthony Beevor, military historian. It was a Saturday morning in the spring of 2013. I was sitting in my car in the parking lot outside the Great River Regional Public Library in St. Cloud, Minnesota. The library doors would be opening in a few minutes. I gathered a few research-related materials, a pen, and a few dollars for the second floor copier. That's where I would spend the next several hours, poring over reel after reel of microfilm archives of the St. Cloud Times newspaper. I had been researching Jacob Wetterling's case ever since hearing about the search of the Razor farm in July 2010. After several months of casual online research, I found myself poring over thousands of posts of the online sleuthing site, websleuths.com. The members of the online forum frequently speculate about potential suspects in Jacob's case, ranging from early suspect Duane Allen Hart to the present-day news revolving around Dan Razor. Among others, questions raised on Web Sleuth's Pinkwood. Why is it so hard to read this book? Oh, I can't wait until it's done. My curiosity further, and it was this thirst for answers that brought me to the media center of the Great River Regional Library. The library's media center was a fairly expensive space dominated by computers spread across several rows of tables and chairs. On the far side of the library's technology area was a massive wall of steel cabinets that held thousands of reels of regional and national newspaper and magazine archives. I had decided to take a chronological approach for this and subsequent research section. My strategy was to gain an understanding of what was going on in the St. Cloud area in the fall of 1989. I was going to say 2012. After getting a sense of what was going on in St. Cloud at the time of Jacob's abduction, I spent the rest of the day printing page after page of the newspaper articles that covered the crime. The articles would be read later from the comfort of my living room in Eau Claire, Wisconsin. One of my earliest and most significant finds was an October 24th, 1989 article in the St. Cloud Times with a direct quote from Dan Razor in which he reported seeing a small car in his driveway at the time of the abduction. I saw lights kind of close together, like a small car. Razer said. It caught my attention because it's unusual for a car to be out there at that time. Razer said that when he arrived at home on Monday night, October 23rd, 1989, he was met near the end of his driveway by Kristen Halkubo, a reporter for the St. Cloud Times newspaper. He said that he had told the reporter about the cars he had seen on Sunday. The quote in the St. Cloud Times struck a chord in me immediately, because for the past 3 years all anyone knew was that Razer had been named a person of interest in Jacob's case. He was the man who lived with his parents at the end of the driveway from which Jacob had been kidnapped more than 20 years ago. The revelation was significant because Razer had recently put himself in the spotlight again, coming forward publicly to proclaim his innocence. Since the search of his family farm in 2010, he had been saying publicly that he saw a car in his driveway at about the time of the abduction. Overtones from investigators and media accounts seemed to suggest that Razer had changed his story over the years, and many who followed the developments closely, including myself, felt that was the case. Another good find was a mysterious sketch that had been posted on Web Sleuths. It was further featured in front page Crime Stoppers article about Jared, the 12-year-old boy who had been abducted and assaulted in Cold Springs on January 13, 1989. Local police resources had developed the original sketch of Jared's assaultant and portrayed a young-looking man with dark hair and a hat. Bat. The better-known sketch of Jared's assaultant wasn't produced until after Jacob's abduction. A highly trained FBI sketch artist developed the sketch in November 1989. I continued to locate and collect newspapers, archives, and online in libraries, buildings on chronological collection that would eventually span more than 1,000 pages of documents. I found that by the collection and cross-referencing similar articles from different newspaper sources, I was able to uncover additional details of investigative findings and activities. Reporters from different papers would report the same story in different ways, often reporting different bits of information than the others. It wasn't so much that the reports differed much or were contradictory. It was more that smaller details were executed in one report, but including in another. Putting all that information together often helped complete the picture, or a little more than it had been before. One by one, I would invariably find in a new, nearly every article a bit or two of usual information. Gradually, I was able to build a more complex puzzle. I shared much of my findings on Web Sleuths. I found a trough of information that seemed to have disappeared from the short list of well-known facts of the case, and I frequently shared copies of articles with blog writers Joy Baker. Baker had been doing her own sleuthing on Jacob Wetterling's case. On the Jacob Wetterling case, focusing on speaking with Dan Razer and Kevin Hamilton, among others. Baker followed the Web Sleuths forum very closely, but was not a registered member, and therefore was unable to access post attachments of articles, maps, and the like. She would frequently ask me to review and provide copies of the documents that were posted by others, or to provide copies of sources of information that I posted there myself. In July 2013, I learned that Al Garber, an FBI agent who had supervised the early Wetterling investigation, had written a book striving to be the best. The book was memorial spanning Garber's entire law enforcement and government service career, had promptly ordered the book and read it with great interest, hoping that Garber had included some information about his work in the Wetterling case. What I found intrigued me more than any information I had found to date. Garber Garber detailed his involvement as the FBI supervisor of the Wetterling investigation. Over several pages of the book, of particular interest to me was information that Garber presented concerning a man who had been surveilled for weeks after Jacob's abduction and who was ultimately arrested in Jared's case. Fibers found in the car the man had owned at the time of Jared's abduction were consistent with fibers from Jared's snowmobile pants. The interview room had been set up with a special light, a flag, and a furniture arranged in a certain way. This information had led to the belief that the man was probably a military man, as suggested by the profile given by the FBI profiler John Douglas. I was very intrigued by the man described in Garber's book. It seemed likely that he would have been the man involved in Jared's abduction and assault, and with early Wetterling investigators' strong belief that Jacob's case was connected to Jared, I believed this was a man that needed to be tracked down. By this point, I had read hundreds and hundreds of pages of newspaper articles, dozens of web pages, and thousands of posts on websleuths.com, and not one of them had ever mentioned a man getting arrested in either Jared's or Jacob's case. Garber's book would turn out to be the second major find of my research effort. By this time in 2013, Joy Baker had met Jared and had been working with him on his own abduction incident. She was communicating with him regularly and learning a lot of information about his case that hadn't been released publicly until she shared the information in her blog. Baker learned about Dion Allen Hart's 1990 arrest for sexually assaulting several juvenile boys from a Web Sleuth member in June 2013. Baker pursued Hart quite heavily, and soon her blog entries demonstrated a heavy lean toward Dawn Hart as the likely suspect in Jared's and Jacob's case. I scanned copies of the relevant pages of Garber's book and emailed them to Baker. Based on the correspondence between Baker and myself, it was clear that she believed that the man described by Garber was Hart. I disagreed and set out on a campaign to learn more about that man. I contacted Garber via email, and Garber agreed to answer any questions in the investigation. However, Garber could not remember the name of the man he had described in his book. When asked specifically about Don Hart, Dion, I think Dwayne, I don't know how to say that name, Hart, he had told me that he didn't recall Hart's name and expressed doubt that he was the man who had been arrested in Jared's case. I completed my search on archives of the St. Cloud Times in the summer of 2013 and then started researching other local newspapers. I found relevant articles and advertisements in the Cold Spring Record and several other documents as the Stearns County Museum in St. Cloud. I continued to share information with Baker and suggested to her that newspaper archives held a trove of key information about Jacob's and Jared's cases. Then, in August 2013, I subscribed to the online archives of the Painesville Press. I had received a tip from a Web Sleuth member that there was articles about Belgrade resident Dawn Hart in the archives. Sure enough, there were several articles detailing Hart's January 24th, 1990 arrest for assaulting boys in the area. There were also several front-page articles concerning assaults on young boys in Painesville in 1986 and 1987. The articles detailed The articles detailed the efforts of the Painesville police to identify the assailant in those cases. There were multiple warnings to parents to keep their kids home after dark. One of the articles mentioned that the Wetterling task force had so far been unable to connect Hart to Jacob's kidnapping or to the series of assaults that had occurred in Painesville in the late 1980s. Knowing that Baker was primarily interested in Hart as a suspect in Jacobs and Jarrett's cases, I contacted her about the Painesville Press archives. She had read about the unsolved cases of attempted assaults in Painesville from 1986 to 1987 and publicized them on her blog. Baker and I sometimes compare notes on information we had found over the course of our research. In one discussion, I mentioned that I had found an article from 1999 where Trevor Wetterling had described Jacob's kidnapper as wearing a dark, puffy coat, like a quilted winter coat. I explained that Trevor had gone to a closet to retrieve the coat to demonstrate to a reporter. Baker said that description was similar to the coat that had left least one of the victims in the Painesville assault incident as described. I continued to pursue the angle of the man arrested in Jarrett's case, as described in Garber's book. Frustrated and determined to find out more about the man, I began emailing several current and formal newspaper and television reporters, writing to as many of 10 reporters beginning in the summer of 2013. I focused my efforts on contacting reporters who had covered the Wetterling case over the years. None of them responded. I followed up several times with Garber as well, but not to avail. I emailed Stearns County investigators about the man in Garber's book, suggesting that the man warranted further attention. I contacted Fox 9 reporter Trish Van Pilsum about stories she had done about a Painesville man while with WCCO, but my pleas went unheeded. It frustrated me that no one responded to my pleas to investigate the information, and I knew that I'd never before been publicly reported, but was probably quite significant. Meanwhile, Baker continued to haunt and on Duane Hart's. She spoke with many of the Painesville assault victims, gathering information from them, and subsequently focused on how the information fit into her theory that Hart was responsible for all the attacks and abductions, zeroing in on a single theory and suspect in it's not uncommon. It is something that even well-trained investigators are prone to do. Baker continued to push Stearns County investigators in the direction of Duane Hart. Captain Pam Jensen, Stearns County's lead investigator working the Wetterling case, interviewed Duane Hart at the Sex Offenders Hospital in Moose Lake, Minnesota, in December 2013. BCA agent Kent McDonald joined Jensen for the interview. During the interview, Duane Hart, I gotta look that up to see how that's spelled or said, because I can't say that name right, denied involvement in all of the crimes: the Painesville assaults, Jared's abduction and assaults, Jacob's kidnapping. He denied all of it. Hart didn't also allow the investigators to take a DNA sample. Investigators had obtained DNA analysis results for the baseball cap that had been left behind by the man who was responsible for the Painesville attack. Jensen and McDonald wanted to compare Hart's DNA to that found on the hat. On December 31st, 2013, I started a project that I had been contemplating since Thanksgiving. Frustrated by the apparent lack of interest from investigative journalists, I decided to undertake an effort to put all the relevant details of the Jacob Wetterling case in one place. I decided to write a book, and I hoped that if the book would put in the right hands, it could jolt someone's memory on attracted the attention of the right person to help solve the case. I titled it, "It Can't Happen Here." Oh my god, I think this is the author. I think this is the author that's... Yeah, no, because he has This Can't Happen Here is another one of Robert M. Dudley's books. Anyway, here, conveying the collective sense of shock that overcame the public at the time of Jacob's kidnapping. Knowing that my research was being to delve into discussing decision with individuals familiar with the Wetterling case, I contacted Petty Wetterling by email in February 2014. In my lengthy email, I informed her that I had been researching Jacob's case for a few years, and I come across information that had been forgotten over the years, and was writing a book that I hoped would help solve the case. I offered the Wetterlings an opportunity to review the book prior to publication. After getting no response from Patty, I forwarded the email to Alison Fair at the Jacob Wetterling Research Center and asked her to forward the email to Patty. Patty later responded with a brief email declining my offer. For a case that was nearly 25 years old and seemed to have gone cold, there was no lack of amateur sleuthers quietly working the case, while other sleuthers speculated with each other about a wide range of theories. Baker and I pushed a lot of buttons independently, trying to draw attention to the clues that seemed to have been left behind along the way. We both were beating the drum in search of answers, but each of us ultimately forged different paths on how to go about accomplishing that. Baker utilized her blog to focus on finding and speaking with more victims of the Painesville assaults and trying to tie them to Duane Hart, while I set out to build a complete history of the Wetterling investigation, to include those assaults as well as other possibilities and potential suspects. In March 2014, the DNA analysis came back on Duane Hart's sample. It was compared to the baseball cap that had been left behind during one of the attacks in Painesville. Results indicate that Duane Hart could not be excluded as a contributor to the DNA found on the hat. The information fueled further investigation in the possible that Duane Hart was involved in all the cases. As the 25th anniversary of Jacob's abduction neared in the spring of 2014, media attention to Jacob's case bloomed again. This this is a long book. Okay. Time that attention resulted from the efforts of blog writer Baker and Jared, the victim of January 13th, 1989 abduction and assault in Cold Springs. Working together with the hope of solving Jared's assault, Baker publicized the report sexual assaults on teenage boys in the Painesville area that had occurred between 1986 and 1987. The Painesville Press newspaper had reported on these assaults a number of times when they occurred in the late 1980s, and the Wetterling Task Force investigating them at the time. Television station WCCO ran with the story of the renewing attention to those older cases and several parts in May 2014. Despite the documented information to the contrary, Esme Murphy's coverage suggests that the 1986-1987 assaults had never been investigated following Jacob's abduction in 1989. The reports also alleged that it was several weeks after Jacob's abduction before investigators considered a possible link between the abduction of Jacob and Jared. However, both J's, I know, the assertion was inaccurate, based on newspaper articles from October 8, 1989, 1889. Those articles, particularly those in the St. Cloud Times, indicated that investigators went public with the potential link almost immediately after Jacob's abduction, and on multiple occasions afterward. In May 2014, other medical media reports suggested that Delbert Huber of Painesville might be a suspect in Jacob Wetterling's kidnapping. Baker had blogged about Delbert and his possible involvement in Jacob's case. She had explored Huber and the characters from the Stearns Truth tapes, among others, in her blog. Delbert Huber and his son, Tim Huber, were all already in prison for the 2011 murder of Timothy Larson. Is that in any related to Aaron? Oh my god, I hope not. Larson's the same last name. According to the reporters, investigators received tips from the public that Huber resembles a sketch of a man who was seen lurking at Tom Thumb story about the time that Jacob was kidnapped. The 2014 media flurry promptly Stearns County investigators to question Huber again, this time in prison. Huber had been questioned in the Wetterling case several times as far back as 1989, but was never named publicly as a suspect in the case. The publicity efforts of Esme Murphy and Joy Baker focused on the likelihood that Darren Hart was the man responsible for the Painesville assaults in the late 1980s and Jared's abduction and assault. By extension, it also meant that they were pushing the agenda that Hart was also responsible for Jacob's abduction. Baker said that she was frustrated with Stearns County investigators for not listening to her pleas about the Painesville incidences. She sent many leads to Stearns County, and although she frequently complained about Stearns County investigators stonewalling her, it appeared that she was successfully in shifting their focus away from Dan Razor and toward Darren Hart. Instead, Baker may have had unreasonable expectations regarding communications with the Sheriff's Department. Naturally, investigators are gatherers of information and would not share case information with an amateur sleuth such as Baker. Baker would eventually demand a meeting with Pam Jensen, the lead investigator working the Wetterling case. Jensen advised Baker that she hadn't discovered any new evidence in the case and hadn't given Stearns County any information they didn't already have. During the summer of 2014, I informed Baker that I was writing a book that I hoped would help solve the Wetterling case. Although telling the Wetterlings themselves about the book, Baker was the first person that I had told. Regrettably, our working relationship began to suffer following that disclosure. Baker and Patty Wetterling had become friends by that point, and Baker seemed to have taken on the role of family advocate, which became evident in her blog writing going forward. Despite her differences, I continued to support Baker's efforts by sending her information and tips and defending her work on online forums. Unfortunately, the differences between Baker and I were a microcosm of the apparent division between investigative agencies during the early days of the Wetterling investigation. Stearns County investigator Pam Jensen and BCA agent Ken McDonald drove to Moose Lake in August 2014 to interview Duran Hart once again. This time they were armed with DNA evidence that showed that Hart might have been the man who had left the cap behind during one of the Painesville incidents. Against Duran, Hart denied any involvement in any of the cases that Stearns County and Joy Baker were looking to him for. He denied any knowledge of the baseball cap. Hart acknowledged that recent news media and Baker's blog were pointing the finger at him, and he told investigators that he felt like he was a suspect in the kidnapping of Jacob Wetterling. Jensen and McDonald asked Hart where he was storing his personal belongings while he was incarcerated at Moose Lake, where he had been for most of the past 25 years. Hart claimed that he has no possession outside of this treatment facility. McDonald later followed up with another investigator to review the facility visitor log and phone logs to determine if Hart had any visitors. The investigator listened to at least one of Hart's phone calls and learned that Hart wanted someone to sell or get rid of items in his storage locker. Previously, Hart had denied everything any personal items outside of the Moose Lake facility. Stearns County and BCA investigators did not believe Hart's denials. On August 22nd, 2014, I think I was in Banff at that time, BCA agent Ken McDonald secured a search warrant to listen to Hart's phone calls and retrieve all visitor logs and phone call records for Duran Hart. Dating back to July 2013, when Baker first began publicizing Hart as a possible suspect in Jacob's kidnapping, the search warrant cited Hart as a viable suspect for Jacob's kidnapping and all the crimes that had been associated with it. The warrant allowed investigators to record and listen to all of Hart's phone calls. Additionally, the warrant provided access to the facility's behavioral reports, investigative reports, and treatment records that may have involved decisions about sexual assaults, kidnappings, and storage of personal items outside of the sex offender treatment facility. By the late summer of 2014, I had gained a reputation as someone who was just digging deep into the Wetterling case. I began to receive contact from individuals who purported to have sleuthed or gathered information about the Wetterling case in the early days of the investigation. In one instance, a former New York City police detective who was retired and living in central Minnesota sent me in 2-inch thick files of documents. I'd spoken with the former detective over the phone several times over the course of my research, and although I found many of the former detectives' their theories to be rather bizarre, I was always interested in learning more about different suspects or the stories of the case. Upon reviewing the file, I discovered that it contained a host of interesting documents related to several subjects I recognized as having been investigated over the course of the Jacob Wetterling kidnapping case. There was copies of lie detector tests, maps of the abduction site, some sketches and photos that I have never seen before, as well as written transcripts of dozens of audio tapes that were known locally as the Stearns Truth Tapes. There was a letter from a behavioral psychologist from Quinceto, Virginia, and there were court records and investigative notes concerning convicted child molesters. I do not want to say that word anymore. There was one interesting set of documents that stood out from the rest. It was a collection of handwritten notes that had been copied, and they appeared to have been written about Duran Allen Hart, the man who had been an early suspect of the investigation in the Wetterling case. I was surprised by the notes and intrigued by their potential significance. The former detective who had sent this inch-thick file had spoken several times about many of the documents in the file, but he had never mentioned anything about the notes pertaining to Durrant Hart. I wondered if the former detective had ever been aware of their presence in the file. The information contained in the notes was stunning. The notes, which were written by a private investigator in February 1990, were difficult to decipher in places. They were very detailed and quite revealing of Hart's life from childhood to the late 1980s. I was quite familiar with Hart, as his name had come up as a subject of the Wetterling investigation several times in the newspaper archives I had researched. Hart also seemed to be primarily focused for small numbers of amateur sleuthers, but for me, and most others, Hart never quite fit the crime. Hart was a groomer, and it seemed he had manipulated access to many young boys. It was unlikely that he would have a need to abduct a boy to satisfy his sexual defiancy. I reviewed the notes over and over again, each time picking up on something new I hadn't noticed before. It was clear to me that Durrant Hart, a convicted sex offender, had been somewhat forthcoming. We're almost done. Hopefully. In his discussion with the investigators, he openly admitted to having had sexual relationship with dozens of individuals, and was rather frank about his drug and alcohol use. In fact, the notes seemed to indicate that Hart was attempting to help investigators narrow the search for the man responsible for Jared's assault and Jacob's abduction. When Hart was shown several sketches of possible suspects in both cases, he identified a handful of men as possible, but suggested one man in particular, Danny Heinrich, who he thought matched the description and sketches of the man in Jared's case in Cold Springs. Hart identified Heinrich in particular because he often wore military-type clothing, drove a dark blue car, had a handheld police scanner, and had a rough, raspy voice when excited. He indicated he heard the man had been arrested for Jared's assault because he owned a fairly new blue car. Each of those items was consistent with a description from Jared's account of his abduction and assault. The following weekend was Labor Day weekend, 2014. The long-anticipated episode of John Welch, The Hunt, featuring the Jacob Wetterling case, was to air on Sunday night. The show opened with a disappearing re-enhancement of Jacob's abduction. There were street lights and an eerie crescent moon included for effort. Neither was an accurate disposition of the actual abduction scene. Therefore, the dead-end road had been completely dark on the night of October 22nd, 1989. The show focused on the possible connection between Jacob Wetterling's abduction and the Painesville incidences that had occurred between 1986 and 1988, and the January 13, 1989 abduction and assault of Jared in Cold Spring. The episode featured the efforts of Joy Baker and made a compelling argument that all those cases were connected. For folks who knew the case well, however, the show was recognizing as a thin, field program about Durrant Allen Hart. Hart was not specifically named during the program, but there was a little doubt that he was the man that Baker was pointing to and trying to connect the cases together. She reasoned that Hart had been in prison since shortly after Jacob's abduction, and that no abductions were reported after Hart's arrest on January 2008. January 24th, 1990. She further suggested that the Painesville incidences had occurred during the times when Hart was not in jail on alcohol or drug-related charges. When court records indicated that Hart was likely to be jailed, there were no assaults reported in Painesville. The logic behind Baker's theory on the dates was hard to ignore. On the surface, it made good sense, and as she pointed out during the program, how many psychopath pedophiles could there be in a 15 to 20-mile radius between St. Joseph and Painesville? As it turned out, there were a lot more than most people could have imagined. From my perspective, Hart had never been very high on my list of suspects. Everything I had read and learned about Hart seemed to indicate that he was on Wetterling's investigators' radar since immediately after Jacob's abduction. With all the media speculations surrounding Hart and the Painesville assaults, I briefly entertained the notion that Hart could indeed have been the predator in all of the cases. In the end, though, I remained skeptical. I had learned through the 3 years of research precisely how emotionally charged theories and closed-minded multimedia had propelled speculation about other potential suspects in the Wetterling case. Examples include the characters and saga told by the Seren's Truth tapes, Tim Hoover and Dan Razor. I argued that Jacob's abductor was more likely to be someone who Hart had abused than it was Hart himself. The premise was that the abductor's fixation on young boys might have derived from learned behavior. The theory is based on the cycle of abuse that often typifies child molesters. I do not want to say that word again. The very cycle of abuse that has been taught by the Wetterling Foundations for decades, regardless of whether or not Durant Hart was a suspect in the Painesville cases or in Jared's case in the Cold Spring. I understand that it was highly unlikely that criminal charges would ever be filed against Hart or anyone else in those cases. For one thing, even investigators were developed strong evidence against Hart or another individual in those cases. Potential prosecution from being hindered by states of elimination. Furthermore, there would be other difficulties in prosecutors using connections between Jacob's kidnapping case and the Painesville cases or Jared's case. Those difficulties would come in the form of unintended consequences of Baker delving into the Painesville cases and Jared's case, as the Painesville cluster of cases attracted publicity, and the suggestions of Hart's possible involvement became the subject of wild speculation. Several of Hart's victims from the 1980s began comparing notes with each other and also with the Painesville cluster victims. They openly discussed Hart's methods for grooming victims, his control tactics, and even his behavior during sexual encounters. Many of the victims in these cases had become convinced of Durant Hart's guilt. Such cross-contamination of witnesses' accounts could pose a serious hindrance to potential prosecution, particularly in Jacob's case due to the likelihood that Jared's and Jacob's cases were related. Their witness accounts were so badly distorted by the fall of 2014 that they would likely to be infected against anyone who could ever face charges in Jacob's case. According to multiple sources, these discussions became so widely known that Stearns County Sheriff's deputies were sent out to ask individuals to stop talking to each other about their experiences with Durant Hart or the Painesville predator. Without a confession by Jacob's abductor or the discovery of his body or some other key physical evidence, prosecution of Defiant and Jacob's case would be all but impossible. I pored over the Hart notes again and again. I afterward thought that notes to Joy Baker in either early September 2014, knowing that she hadn't seen nothing before and that she would have an interest in them due to her pursuit of connecting Hart to the abduction and assault cases. In the email to Baker, I accompanied the Hart notes with comments that the private investigator had said that Durant Hart had suggested one of the Heinrich's brothers, either Danny or David, has likely suspect in the assault of Jared. Baker then forwarded the Hart notes to Patty Wetterling and commented back that Patty had never seen them before. On September 10, 2014, I forwarded a copy of the Hart notes to St. Cloud-based FBI agent Shane Ball in Stearns County, and many emails to the Ball Stearns County. I noted that it was clear one of the Hart notes that Hart had been looking at by Wetterling investigators. Almost done. In connection to the Painesville case and for Jared's and Jacob's cases, I offered to speak with investigators about possible suspect that Hart had provided in the notes and other information and connections that had uncovered in my research. I received no response. Then on Saturday evening, September 13th, 2014, FBI agent Shane Ball emailed me and asked about the source of the Hart's notes. I responded to Ball with a detailed explanation on how I had come across the notes and who had authored them. I immediately notified Baker and Patty Wetterling of Ball's apparent interest in the notes. I had sent several tips to Agent Ball in the past, and I knew that there was a level implied significance to the fact that Ball had inquired about the source of the Hart notes. Sending tips to the FBI and the Stearns County was typically one-way communication, with no response expected or received. Ball was relatively new to the St. Cloud office and Wetterling case, but he had also always demonstrated an interest in listening and learning more about several suspects. Understanding the significance in Ball's inquiry, I called the private investigator once more, reviewing with him again to the time he spent with Hart in his jail cell. By the time he had received a copy of the notes from me and had a chance to review the notes for himself, the investigator reiterated that it was his professional opinion that Hart was probably not involved in the Painesville incidences, nor in Jacob's or Jared's cases, because those assaults did not fit Hart's modus operandi. Hart was a groomer. He used drugs, alcohol, and money to secure sexual favors from juvenile boys and adult males. There was no doubt in the private investigator's mind that Durant Hart had suggested Dan Heinrich as the likely abductor in Jared's case and therefore in Jacob's case as well. With that, I followed up with an email to FBI agent Ball on September 14, 2014, suggests that Durant Hart had pointed to Dan Heinrich as the likeliest predator in the cases. Heinrich's name was all over the notes, and it was usually marked with an asterisk or other indicator, and it was boldly circled on the front page of the notes. The notes made reference to Heinrich's fascination with police scanners, the fact that he owned a fairly new dark blue four-door car and would often wear camouflage clothing, that he had a raspy, kind like mine, voice when he was excited, all of which were detailed that were consistent with Jared had described about his abductor. Furthermore, the notes indicated that Hart had heard that Heinrich had been arrested in the cases of some point. I included that Heinrich was probably the man that had been detailed in Garber's book. The similarities were too powerful to ignore. I forwarded the baker my email tip to FBI agent Ball about Dan Heinrich as a likely suspect. Baker and I had previously discussed that Hart knows over the phone, and I shared my insight that I appeared Darren Hart was trying to help investigators identify Jacob's abductor. There was, of course, little doubt that Hart had committed atrocious acts against children, and it was readily apparent that he had left a wide swath of hurt and destruction in his path. The Hart notes were the climax of my research, and I knew it would be very unlikely that I would come across anything else as significant. Despite that, I continued with my research and worked to the touch of all points, asked questions, cross-checked every information between similar newspaper articles, and so forth. I would occasionally take breaks from my research, but also came back for another round of reviews, looking for those little bits of information, or making connections I hadn't picked up on the last few times, through my mountains of materials. I had done some of my research at the Stearns County Museum in St. Cloud. Sarah Warmka, a museum archivist, quickly took an interest. Warmka also happened to be the leader of the Granite City Book Club. Once I shared with Warmka that I was writing a book about the Jacob Wetterling kidnapping, she invited me to present a discussion to the club. They agreed to schedule the discussion prior to publication, as I wanted to get feedback from readers about the material in the manuscript. I understood the subject of the book was sensitive to the St. Cloud area as a whole, and wanted to make sure that materials came across as respectful, accurate, and relevant. Before the book club decision could be scheduled, Warmka left the museum for a position in another part of the state. The new book club leader contacted me in September 2014, reiterating the club's interest in hosting an author discussion. They set a date of the discussion for January 21st, 2015. Before I started working at Costco. I got hired this summer of 2015. I emailed Stearns County Detective Pam Jensen, the lead detective working Jacob's case, and offered her a chance to strike any information from the manuscript that she declined, saying that she had already read through it and had no objections. She asked me to provide a copy of the book when published, and wished me good luck. The original unfinished manuscript was emailed to book club members in November 2014. As the date of the meeting approached, the Granite City Book Club issued a press release, and the event was mentioned in several radio and newspaper briefings. Book club meetings were typically small, but the average expected a large crowd would be on hand for this event due to Jacob Wetterling's significance to the local area. I called the day before the book club event to confirm all the details. Everything was set. Then, on the day of the event, just hours before it was scheduled to start, they suddenly canceled the meeting without citing a reason, other than they had to receive a couple of emails expressing concern about the meeting. A notice was posted on the door to the museum, advising would-be attendees that the book discussion had been cancelled. Despite the setback, I continued work on the manuscript, finishing it in March 2015. I believe that Baker, the media, and Stearns County investigators had all been pursuing the wrong suspect in the Wetterling case. During Hart, they were overlooking the cycle of sexual abuse that would suggest that the abductor was more likely someone whom Darren Hart had abused. Since I was not able to get feedback from the book club, I instead sought in from several acquaintances that were quite familiar with the history of the Jacob Wetterling case. The feedback was overwhelmingly positive, and the book was ultimately released as a self-published volume in April 2015. It covered the entire history of the case and detailed what I determined to be key aspects of the case, forgotten leads, observation based on analysis of available information, and several questions that had never been addressed by passive media. Those forgotten leads were about to come back full circle to the forefront of the investigation. Yeah, that's it. That concludes Chapter 8. Tomorrow will be Chapter 9. We're almost to the end of our book. Thank you so much for watching my videos. And a shout out to my coworker Star, who I call Starlight, for subscribing to my channel and liking my videos. Thank you so much, Star. Please subscribe, comment, and like. And don't forget to check out our Facebook page. And dare to dream, guys.